In this modern fantasy world, reality intertwines with fantasy, and science coexists with the supernatural. A female doctor's journey will take us to explore the unknown and challenge our perception of reality. Don't miss this story filled with magic and miracles. Chapter 17 Tears of a Ghost. I know it happened right after they were married, Vincent told Sean once they were out on the street. The rain had changed to flurries that drifted aimlessly, too half-hearted to be much more than a nuisance to motorists. They walked down Grant Street, headed toward the courthouse. They had just gotten back from their honeymoon. Sean picked up the narrative. I mean literally. The husband was unpacking the car they'd gone to Ireland, where he was from, and the wife walked down the street to pick up groceries. We figure Redding must have pushed his way inside behind Moran. There were a couple of suitcases dumped by the front door. Redding worked over Moran pretty good. Stabbed him, beat him, clubbed him with a broken chair leg. Then he hog-tied the guy with a cord he cut from the vacuum cleaner. Vincent didn't want to visualize the brutality Sean was describing, but images of blood and pain flashed into his mind unbidden. All along, Moran must have been working to get Redding out of the house before the wife returned, Sean continued, and suddenly his tone was no longer that of a cop, but of a husband. Probably offered the guy anything, everything to leave. But the whole problem was that Redding was fixated on Grace, had been stalking her for almost a year. Grace was what he wanted. And Moran marrying her set Redding off. Guy saw Moran as defiling the woman that, in his warped mind, belonged to him and him alone. That's when the wife came home. She had her arms filled with grocery bags, left a bunch on the stoop while she carried the rest inside, calling for the husband to come help her. Redding caught her just inside the door, blitz attack. She didn't stand a chance. He clubbed her with the chair leg, and when she came to, she was lying face to face with her husband. Her arm was broken and her face was pretty messed up. Redding was trying to saw off her ring finger with a kitchen knife. Vincent shuddered and told himself he should have worn a warmer coat. Grace tried to plead with Redding, got him to stop cutting on her long enough for her to slide the emerald engagement ring and her wedding band off and give them to him. She watched as Redding began to beat the hell out of Moran. I mean, this guy's face was so messed up, I doubt his mother would have known him. He was probably already dead, or as good as. She could have tried to run, might have even made it, but instead she crawled over to shield the husband, put herself between Redding and Moran. Sean sucked in his breath, raised his face as if scrutinizing the clouds, seeking answers to the madness he was describing. That was the last straw for Redding. He turned on her, beat the crap out of her and worse, then left them both for dead. He paused. That's the short version. Whole thing took hours. Jesus, Vincent breathed out. Jesus wasn't anywhere near that house that night, Sean said with conviction. The wife said she never actually blacked out for more than a few minutes, just long enough for Redding to think she was dead and take off. She comes to, she's got the broken arm, skull's fractured in 3 places, her face is all messed up, broken ribs, collapsed lung, internal bleeding, you name it, she's got it. Still, she manages to crawl to the front door, where she got the attention of a neighbor walking his dog. Next day, we caught Redding based on her description. Bastard still had the bloody damned rings in his pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief for Chris' sake. She testified. Vincent was surprised. He'd assumed that Grace's career as a recluse had begun right after the murder. Sean nodded. At the prelim. She was one tough cookie. Gave her first statement to me from the back of an ambulance, the second from a bed in the ICU, tubes and wires and God knows what coming out of her. Never changed her story. Defense was never able to shake her on the stand, even though they had experts who said with her head injuries there was no way she could have remembered everything so accurately. Judge almost threw the case out before it even began. That is pretty remarkable. Usually there's amnesia, or at the very least some confusion, jumbling of names, faces, memories. They were stopped at the light on Grant Street, waiting to cross over to the formidable stone courthouse. Pittsburgh's fortress of justice, it resembled an ancient castle, a tower of inquisition. The light changed but Sean didn't move. Vincent looked over at the detective and knew there was more to the story. That's what she said herself. You know she was a doctor, right? Vincent swiveled his head to stare at the detective. Grace Moran was a doctor. Sure, over at Angels. Worked the ER. She was good, too. Sean shook his head, looked away. Once upon a time, I guess. She did have one thing confused, the detective admitted. It took a while to come out because none of us put it in any of the reports. All the woman had been through, we couldn't see opening her up to ridicule. And we didn't think it had any bearing on the case against Redding. She was rock solid on her ID, and we had physical evidence out the wazoo. What was it? The coroner put Moran's time of death at least 3 hours before the 911 came through, probably longer. But when the neighbor found Moran, she was insisting that he help her husband. She even crawled back into the room, gasping out first aid directions to the guy. The guy freaked out. He could see the husband was dead, had been dead a while, was ice cold, blue already. When the paramedics arrived, they find the wife cradling the husband in her arms, saying he just died, that there was nothing she could do, it was too late. Well, they agreed with the neighbor, but didn't say anything to the wife, figuring she's in shock. But she's perfectly lucid otherwise, even insists on talking to me before they run her over to Angels of Mercy. What did she say? Sean sighed. Said her husband was still alive while Redding was beating and raping her, that after Redding left, the husband spoke to her, giving her the strength she needed to make it to the door and get help. Even told me his last words to her, some Irish thing. I didn't get it, but she insisted that he spoke to her while the neighbor was on his cell phone to 911. He paused and tilted his head up once again, gazing into the low-hanging clouds above. If he didn't know better, Vincent would swear that the cop who'd seen the worst Pittsburgh had to offer was blinking back tears. You're the doctor, you tell me. Why would your brain play tricks on you like that? I mean, wouldn't it be more comforting to know your husband died quickly than to hallucinate that he was dying in front of your eyes and you could do nothing to save him? I just don't get it. But she never gave it up, never changed her story. She really believed her husband was still alive and with her the whole time. Vincent shrugged. He sure as hell didn't have the answers. Guess it isn't too surprising after all that she went off the deep end, Sean finished, a tone of regret in his voice. What happened to Redding? Sean turned his head and spat a wad of mucus into the gutter. After the prelim, the DA heard about her confusion from the neighbor when he interviewed him. He turned chicken's hit, too afraid that Redding's lawyer would make mincemeat of Moran under the stress of a real trial. Jagoff lawyer convinced the DA to accept a verdict of guilty secondary to mental defect. Redding's still at Western Psych, far as I know. Unless we got lucky and some other Looney Tune shivered him. He stepped off the curb. Well, I gotta go make sure another scumbag doesn't get off. He turned back to Vincent, oblivious to the traffic passing behind him. Let me know what happens to Grace Moran. She's a good person, doesn't deserve this shit. Vincent watched as the detective crossed the street against the light and jogged up the steps into the courthouse. He glanced at his watch, almost 4 o'clock. Time to return to the scene of the crime. Vincent reached Grace's Squirrel Hill duplex a few minutes early for his appointment with Ingrid Garman. He parked across the street and watched as a blue Toyota Corolla pulled into the Moran driveway. A young woman in her mid-20s emerged. Vincent stared for a moment, uncertain. Ingrid Garman had sounded older on the phone, spoke with the wisdom of the ages. But the woman took the steps at a brisk pace, and he decided it must be her, or the elusive Grace Moran. Could he be that lucky? Mrs. Garman. He called as he crossed the street and followed her up the cement steps. I'm Vincent Embark. She paused outside the door and turned to him. Her skin was freckled, her hair so pale it appeared as ghostly wisps escaping from the braid she wore. Her eyes were pale also, a shade between blue and grey, as washed out as faded denim. "You the doctor?" she said, one hand on her hip as her eyes interrogated him. "Yes, m'm." Though the housekeeper was almost a decade younger than Vincent, he still felt compelled to address her in a formal manner. He proffered his photo ID from Angels of Mercy, and she scrutinized it. "I appreciate you taking the time. I'm getting paid, so I'm gonna earn it." She opened the door and motioned him inside the foyer. Vincent hesitated, reminded himself that Jimmy Moran's bloody and battered corpse wouldn't be waiting for him beyond. Still, as he crossed the threshold, he imagined luggage scattered amidst bloody bags of groceries. Ingrid walked briskly past him, obviously not the type to see ghosts. Vincent followed her through the foyer into the living room. Windows filled two of the walls and a fireplace took up most of the rear wall. A well-aged camel-colored leather sofa established the boundary between the foyer and the room. Two comfortable-appearing overstuffed chairs sat in front of the window facing it. A large oriental rug, faded with time, filled the center of the room. Another, smaller, newer rug sat behind the sofa, jutting out into the passageway. Vincent noted that Ingrid skirted this rug without breaking her rhythm. He stood at the edge of the sofa and looked down at the rug. It was spotless, well coordinated with the rest of the room, but somehow felt jarringly out of place. The one solid wall extended from the foyer back past the living room into the rear of the house, where it met a staircase going upstairs. The common wall between the two duplexes. As Ingrid sorted mail onto a table beside the steps, he thought about Sean Kelly's description of the crime scene. Both Jimmy and his wife had been ambushed just inside the front door. Vincent cut his eyes back down the foyer to the front door. He hastily took a step back away from the rug that looked so right, but felt so out of place. The rug that lay just about where Jimmy Moran had died. "Mrs. Garman saw his flinch and nodded her head, leaving the mail to join him. "Yeah, right, there's where it happened," she said with the voice of authority that she seemed to take about every subject. The couch wasn't there then, it was against the windows. There was just a chair and end table, they are both gone now. Smashed to bits. Vincent drew his breath in, startled by her nonchalant description of a murder weapon. Their blood about covered the floor, she gestured to the immaculate oak floorboards, from here to the door and back again. She shook her head, sking at the mess a murder made. They said there was blood and other bits on the walls, even the ceiling. Vincent looked up with a shudder, as if half expecting unidentified bits to come crashing back to earth around him. "You seem to know a lot about it," he told her, remembering her previous statement that she hadn't pried into her employer's drama. "Just because I wouldn't talk to Mrs. Moran about it, didn't mean I didn't look into what happened before I came here. Got to check things out. What if there'd been a reason for Lucas Redding to come back? Or if he had friends?" She shook her head. "But no, it was just blind luck, that's all. Ain't it always the nicest people that the worst things happen to? Mrs. Moran's neighbors, they all said about how happy them two were. How you could call anytime, day or night, and Jimmy'd come get your car jumped, or he and the missus often would shovel everyone's walks after a snow without being asked, just 'cause they liked to. Back when the missus still could, she'd even help out Mr. Agostino with his medicines. He takes so many he can't keep them straight, you know, and she'd always be checking on Mrs. Purcell, make certain she was getting her insulin okay, while the mister would be cleaning out her gutters, or the like. Sounds like they were a nice couple." She shot him a look that said that was an understatement. "More than that," she asserted. "They was good people." Vincent noted her use of the past tense, as if Grace Moran had stopped being a person after Jimmy died. His fists clenched in the pockets of his overcoat, as he wished desperately that he could give Grace a second chance. Not just at living, but at life. Wanna see something? Mrs. Garman asked, her voice lowered as if worried that someone might be listening. All right. With a flourish she whipped back the small rug behind the couch. They tried and tried, but couldn't get all of it out, she told him, kneeling down to brush her fingers against the palm-sized stain on the pale oak floorboards. Said they'd have to sand it down, but she told Em to leave it. Vincent crouched down, drawn against his will to the bloodstain. A man's life force that refused to be banished from sight or memory. His fingers reached out to hover over it, as if the owner could still be felt through it. Mrs. Garman rocked back on her heels. That's just what she does, she told him. The missus, she comes down here when she can't sleep. I can't tell you how many times I've come in the morning and seen her through the front windows, curled up like a baby on the bare floor, her hand right there like she's searching for something she lost. Those days I'll ring the bell, pretend like I've lost my keys. Vincent doubted that the young woman in front of him ever lost track of anything. She'll come and open the door and the rug will be back in place, but, she paused, building to the climax of her campfire ghost story, when her back's turned, I'll look and that spot will be wet. She finished, daring him to explain away her modern miracle. Now, that's true love if I ever heard it. More likely a combination of tears, sweat and condensation, Vincent thought. But something did seem to pulsate from the stain on the floor. He jerked his hand away and got to his feet. He was a scientist, didn't believe in ghosts. Those are bad days, she continued, straightening the rug and covering the living testament to a dead man's life force. There are worse. Days when she'll lock herself up in her room, not eating, not talking, as if she were dead to the world. Or, she turned her shrewd gaze up to the ceiling, as if she could see through it to the heart of the matter, the world's dead to her. She's lucky to have someone like you to watch over her, Vincent said, as he got to his feet and brushed his slacks off. Doubt she'd see it that way. Should have heard her cussing me out when the ambulance guys drug her away last week. And then I had to leave her alone in that hospital. My sister went and had herself twins, born a month early. Mrs. Garman sighed as if the weight of the world was upon her shoulders. She turned away, picked up the stack of mail. I think maybe she wants to die, thinks it'll fix everything. Some days I think she might be better off if she had died way back then. Some days she thinks it too. Others she shrugged. Ain't none of my business, I'm just a housekeeper. Vincent knew a mother's instinct when he heard it. Ingrid Garman definitely was more than a housekeeper to Grace Moran. No wonder the woman was so protective over her charge. Do you have any photographs of Mrs. Moran? He asked, adopting Ingrid's formal tone in addressing her employer. He'd seen the inside of Grace's brain, but never her face. He followed as Mrs. Garman led the way to the fireplace and the framed photos collected there. Aren't you worried that rearranging things would upset Mrs. Moran? Vincent asked, remembering Grace's diagnosis of OCD. Ingrid only scared. She's not crazy, she said. She's perfectly fine around here. Sometimes she can even be downright sloppy about things like a kid or something. And if she's spent the day in the garden, she goes outside to the garden. Course she does. Sleeps out there when the weather's nice. Has an air mattress, got some, what CHA call it, mosquito netting, and she sleeps out under the stars, she sighed. Those are the good nights. And the bad ones? The bad ones she'll end up down here. She nodded behind him to the area behind the couch. Or she'll be up the entire night, sometimes 2, 3 nights in a row, working herself into a frenzy. Always worse around their anniversary, his birthday. There's medication. She ain't no fool and neither am I, the housekeeper retorted. She tried them at first, but said they didn't seem to make the pain any better, just made the rest of her numb. Decided she'd rather live with the pain, and when she was ready to let it go, she would. But she's built a prison for herself, he protested. She was a doctor once. She could be out there, helping people, doing what? She can help people from inside here, but on her terms instead of theirs. She does a lot of good on her website. She gets people money from insurance companies that are trying to gyp them. She helps them cut through the medical gobbledygook you doctors bout drown em in. And what's so great about the world out there? She jutted her chin at the window. I live there and I have to tell you, there's a lot of days it's a hell of a lot nicer in here. I just wish I had her guts to turn my back on it all, tell all those so-called normal people to go to hell and leave me alone. She said this last in the tone of a mother proud of her child's accomplishments. Vincent had to admit he didn't have a very good argument to offer her. What was he to do? Quote the Psychiatric Diagnostic and Statistical Manual's criteria for agoraphobia, post-traumatic stress, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. That wouldn't convince the woman in front of him that Grace Moran was sick, that her choices had been wrong, a legacy of her trauma rather than her own free will. He had to admit, he wasn't so certain if he agreed with Hellman that Grace Moran was incompetent. Despite her meeting the criteria for several serious psychiatric diagnoses, he was beginning to think that Grace Moran had created a reasonable method of coping with her own very unreasonable living hell. Here, you wanted to see a picture, Garman continued. She lifted a heavy silver-framed 8x10 photo from the mantel and gave it to Vincent. The metal frame felt cold in his hands. He looked down into the faces of two people obviously very much in love. The man was tall, with red hair and a gaze that seemed focused solely on the woman beside him, oblivious to the camera or anything else that existed in the outside world. It's their wedding picture, Garman said. Vincent's gaze focused on the woman beside Jimmy Moran, and the frame almost slipped from his grasp. Staring out at the camera with brilliant dark blue eyes was Alex Weiss' mother, the woman calling herself Marie D'Angelo. Did Mrs. Moran have any sisters? He asked, scrutinizing the photo. This woman's face had a few subtle differences from D'Angelo's. Grace Moran's cheekbones were higher, had a different curve, her eyebrows more even as well. But there was no mistaking or disguising those eyes or that intense stare. Nope. She was an orphan. Her ma abandoned her when she was just a few days old. Mrs. Garman took the photo from his trembling fingers before he could drop it. An orphan. Abandoned. Just like Alex. Could the differences in her face be the product of the injuries she'd received from Redding's beating? No. It couldn't be the same woman. He'd talked with D'Angelo, had coffee, a meal with her. She functioned perfectly well, didn't act at all like an agoraphobic outside of her comfort zone. Wouldn't an agoraphobic flee the hospital, want to return back home as soon as possible? Marie D'Angelo seemed content to remain at Angels, tending to Alex, mooching off the system. One mysterious woman with a horrific past, fleeing a frightful future. One woman with a mysterious past, trying to give a dying child some comfort in his future. Two women or one? His eyes widened as he thought. He stared at the photo again. Grace Moran was Marie D'Angelo, he was certain of it. Hellman would be ecstatic, his pet project wasn't gone missing, but was building a new life for herself right under his nose at Angels of Mercy. Chapter 18 Wheeling and Dealing. The drive back to Angels of Mercy was a blur as Vincent tried to untangle the ramifications of his discovery. He could deliver the prize to the chairman, be assured of Hellman's backing for an attending position, as well as his support in the malpractice case. All he had to do was betray Alex and, by doing so, save Grace Moran's life. If she didn't want the surgery, why had she stayed at Angels of Mercy? Why pretend to be Alex's mother? Christ, he hoped the kid had some inkling that she was lying. He couldn't bear to make Alex cry again. Not his fault, he told himself firmly. He hadn't started this charade, Grace had. He clenched the steering wheel tighter, angry that he'd felt the slightest tinge of envy or sympathy for the woman. She was a doctor, damn it, How could she do that to a kid like Alex? It had to be the tumor, it made her unstable. Hellman was right, she needed to be locked up, forced to have the surgery. Grace Moran was in no condition to decide anything for herself, that much was clear. He parked the Mustang in the employee lot and slogged through puddles back into Angels of Mercy. The snow changed back to rain, but he paid it no attention. The memory of Alex's smile this morning when he'd introduced Grace, as his mother filled Vincent's mind. Damn, this was going to be tough. After dropping his sodden parka back at his office and shrugging into his lab coat, Vincent headed for Alex's room at the far end of the hallway. To his relief, Grace wasn't there. He didn't want a scene, not in front of Alex. He paused in the doorway, watching as Alex practiced a magic trick, making cards seem to slide from 3 stacks on their own volition. Nice trick. Want to do it for me? Alex looked up with a frown and hastily pushed the cards back together. No, I'd better not. I tried it earlier and it went all wrong. Vincent sat on the edge of Alex's bed and pushed the table separating them to one side. We need to talk. He watched as Alex's lips turned down and the boy looked out the window at the sheets of rain. It's about your mother, Vincent continued. Grace? Alex jerked up at that, pivoting his slight frame to sit Indian style on the bed, all focus now on Vincent's face. Don't make her go away. Please, Dr. V. Alex, I'm sorry. But she's a very sick lady. And she may be unstable, even dangerous. She needs help. She's not dangerous. She's here to help. Convincing you that a transplant is not in your best interests is not helping. That wasn't Grace's idea, Alex protested. That was me. I asked her, told her I guess I was just wishing out loud. Don't blame Grace for that. I'm sorry the way this has worked out. Grace should have known better. Should have never put you and Kat in the middle. She didn't. It was our fault. We found her, we just wanted to keep her for a while, that's all. It was Kat's idea to say she was my mom, not Grace's. Alex was practically bouncing on the bed in his eagerness to explain. Vincent thought back to the morning, to the look on Grace's face when Kat had introduced her. She had seemed just as surprised as Vincent was. But she had gone along with the lie. She helped Kat, Alex continued. Got her to finish her download. And she's a doctor, just like you. She saved my life once. She's not like me, Vincent said, standing up and pacing alongside the bed. We're nothing alike. Of course not, a nagging voice whispered in his mind. Grace made Alex happy, had him smiling. All you seem to be able to do is make him cry. Vincent whirled at the foot of the bed, planted his hands on the railing and leaned his weight on them. Alex, I don't know what Grace has been telling you, but you have to trust me about the transplant. It really is the best thing for you. Maybe he couldn't make Alex laugh like Grace did, but he sure as hell could do his job and keep him alive. Alex's lips pressed together, and he looked away from Vincent for a long moment. If I say yes, will you let Grace stay? Just for one night. Please? I never had a family before now. When Alex stared up at Vincent with such deep longing in those intense blue eyes, he was damned near impossible to deny. We'll see, Vincent hedged. First I need to talk with her. Where is she? You her. Alex shook his head vigorously. First you need to promise. Grace gets to stay with me one more night before you lock her up with the freaks. Alex. I'm trying to help Dr. Hellman save her life. Don't you understand? She has a brain tumor. She'll die without treatment. Alex merely leveled a stare on Vincent and sat silently, patiently waiting for Vincent to cave. Vincent knew better than to try to resist. Over his many years in the hospital, Alex had learned all the tricks of how to get his own way. In most things, at least. One night, Then I tell Dr. Hellman where to find her. And, he added, you don't say anything else about a do not resuscitate order, or not wanting a transplant. Deal? Alex narrowed his eyes at Vincent's outstretched hand, then nodded and shook it vigorously. Deal. Now, where is she? Gone to visit Kat. Over in the tower. Thanks. Vincent slid off the bed. You get some rest while I go track down your mysterious friend. And I'm on call tonight, so I'll be here to keep an eye on things. To his surprise, Alex's smile was bright enough to banish the gloom of the storm clouds from the room. Great. It'll just be like having a real family. Grace found Kat alone in her room, the door shut. Okay if I come in? She called. She poked her head inside after knocking again, and receiving no answer. Kat shrugged. She sat in the chair beside the window, knees hugged to her chest, staring out into the grey skies beyond. Grace perched on the window ledge. Alex and I spent the day sneaking a look at your records, she began after a lengthy silence. I think I can answer your questions about your surgery now. Kat shrugged again, didn't make eye contact. Sure, whatever. Not the answer Grace was expecting. She laid a hand on Kat's shoulder. The girl flinched away from the contact. What's wrong? Did something happen? The tech said my download is complete. I can have my surgery any day now. Kat's tone was leaden. You were hoping it would take longer. No? Kat looked up, her eyes held a hard edge to them. I want the surgery. I want to get it over with, get out of this place where everyone lies and you can't trust anyone. Grace straightened at the steel and bitterness underlying Kat's words. Who lied? She asked, wondering if Eve Warden had done something to upset Kat. Who can't you trust, Kat? You, for starters. Kat turned her face into her shoulder, swiped at her eyes before looking up. I heard the nurses talking. Everyone's looking for you, Grace. Why didn't you tell me about your surgery? All that time spent trying to convince me to have mine, that it's my only hope, but you never mentioned that it's your only hope too. Except you're going to run away home and let your cancer kill you, aren't you? Aren't you, Grace? Grace pulled away from Kat's all-too-true accusations. Her back pressed against the frigid glass window, the shriek of the wind vibrated into her bones. Here I was crying about what a scaredy cat I was, but you're the one who's a coward, Kat continued mercilessly. You're just like all the other freaks. You're all trying to kill yourselves, in your own way. Not me. I'm getting out of this place. I'm going home to my horse and my dog and brothers and sisters and parents, and I'm going to live. You and the other freaks, her voice cracked with tears, can all just go to hell. Kat wept openly, her glare pinning Grace in place. This time Kat didn't bother to wipe away the tears. Instead she got to her feet and stalked to the door, holding it open. Get out, Grace. You did what you came here for. Now go on home and die, just like you want. I don't care. Grace took a hesitant step toward the door, searching for words to comfort Kat, to explain herself. But Kat spoke the truth. There was no defense against that. I said, go home. Kat shouted when Grace didn't move fast enough to suit her. Grace stumbled to the door, her own tears blinding her. She stopped and reached a hand out to Kat, who batted it away. I'm sorry, Kat, she said. Kat slammed the door shut behind her, leaving Grace shivering in the empty corridor. Grace wrapped her arms around her chest, wishing she'd taken the time to steal a lab coat in addition to the scrubs. She glanced down the hallway and noted curious stares from the other patients, who pressed their faces into tiny slits left by their ajar doors. No one bold enough to come out and confront her, they seemed content to watch and listen from behind their barricades. Her gaze caught the frosted glass door at the end of the hall. A man's silhouette was pressed against it, his fists drumming a desperate beat on the thick, reinforced glass. A beat that thundered through her skull, blinding her with pain. Grace whirled and fled through the double doors at the exit from the ECU, stumbling right into Vincent's arms. Chapter 19. Wishing hour. Vincent stumbled back, as Grace Moran plowed into him. Her eyes were wide, her face a ghastly white, highlighting the faint scars. She looked scared as hell. "Are you all right, Grace?" he asked, setting her back onto her feet. She glanced around at the oak doors behind her, as if something was chasing her. "I'm fine. I just need to go home," she mumbled. She straightened, pulling away from him. "What did you call me?" "Your name." "Grace?" He scrutinized her with the eye of a clinician. She was shaking, looked ready to fall down at any moment. "Here," he guided her to the love seat opposite the elevators. "Sit. We need to talk." She nodded absently, her fingers tracing the 7 staples along her temple, then pulling her hair forward once more to cover them. The incandescent light from the 2 stick lamps on the end tables played over her features, softening them. But Vincent's vision was filled with images of blood and torn tissue. Each nuance of healed tissue now revealed the grim secret of its origin. His anger at her for interfering with Alex's care eased. He was ashamed of his earlier denouncement of Grace Moran as a victim, even blaming her for what he assumed had happened to her. The woman standing before him was no victim. She was a fighter. Or at least she once was. "Why don't you want the surgery?" he asked in a gentle voice, laying his hand over hers. She stared down at his hand, slid hers away, hugging herself around the chest. Vincent wished he had a sweater or blanket to offer her. But all he had was his lab coat. "Please," she said, not meeting his eyes, instead staring out the window at the garishly lit helipad on the annex roof across the void that separated the 2 buildings. "All I want to do is go home." "I know." She nodded at that, her gaze still fixed on the annex. "Why didn't you leave yesterday? Why did you stay?" "I tried. I couldn't. Then I met Kat and Alex." She broke off, turned to face him, as if emerging from a trance. "How do you know who I am?" "Sean Kelly is a friend of mine. He says hi, hopes you're feeling better. Ingrid is worried too." "Ingrid, you were at my house." Her voice took on an edge. "How dare you? Who gave you the right?" "Grace, you're a sick woman. Wandering alone on the streets for all we knew. Dr. Hellman was concerned, asked me to find you." "Worried about making history, you mean? With me as a guinea pig?" She stood now, hands dropping to her sides. "Maybe I don't want to make history. Maybe I just want to go home. To die." He stood as well, facing her. "Yes?" She challenged him with an upraised eyebrow. "Happens to all of us sooner or later, doctor. If that's what you really, truly wanted, then you would have left yesterday. I thought you were a pediatrician, not a shrink." "Actually, I'm boarded in both medicine and pediatrics. But it doesn't take a psychiatrist to see that there was a reason you couldn't force yourself to leave Angels of Mercy, a reason why you're here right now." She glanced back over her shoulder at the doors to the ECU. "I wanted to help Kat. No one," she shot a disapproving glare at Vincent, "prepared her for her surgery, what to expect. I promised I'd help and I did. So now I can go home. You're the one who convinced her to finish her download." She nodded. "Guess I should thank you for that. But what about Alex? Are you just going to abandon him? He's over in his room right now, waiting for you. Begged me to let you stay with him tonight, has some fantasy that you're as close as he'll ever get to a real mom." She stepped back until the doors to the skyway blocked her path. "I didn't ask him to pretend I was his mom, I know you didn't. But kids," he shrugged, "sometimes their imagination runs away from them. If you leave, it will break his heart. Her shoulders bowed as if he'd placed a great burden on her. He only hoped she realized it was also a fragile burden. A gust of wind rattled the windows beside her. The lights in the skyway flickered. She raised her head and gave him a half smile. You really do care about him, don't you, Vincent? Sure I do. He's a great kid. And that's why I got into this business. I'll look the other way if you stay tonight. She bit her lip and nodded. I guess one more night won't matter. Jimmy knew he shouldn't have any memory of these things, just as he shouldn't be here now, watching, waiting, yearning for the woman he'd lost 4 years ago. 4 years. Was that an eternity or a heartbeat? Neither, both he could not say. Nor did he understand why he couldn't follow her. His celestial leash seemed to end not quite halfway along the skyway, beneath the maintenance hatch set into the flat glass roof. So he paced the limits of his domain, remembering, reliving. After he rescued her from Maeve's crypt, Jimmy and Grace had spent another day in the beehive hut, trapped by the storm. On the morning of the second day, Jimmy woke alone. He stood up, groggy, reaching for his shirt. The fire was lit, as were 2 of his lanterns, coffee was brewing, but no Grace. He turned around in a complete circle. There was nowhere to hide in the small confines of the stone hut. Wind howled through the cracks between the stones, echoing the fury and fear Jimmy felt building inside of him. He wrenched the top guarding the doorway back, fighting the tempest for possession of it. The rain had eased but the clouds were tearing across the sky, ripped into shreds by the banshee gale that screamed from every direction at once, mourning the spent storm. What little rain there was hurled like daggers by the ferocious wind, biting at Jimmy's skin with sharp, painful nips. No one with the sense God gave a cow would be outside in this, Jimmy thought as his eyes scoured the horizon, searching for signs of Grace. Nothing. He returned inside, now cold and wet for his efforts, and cursed. Damn Yank. Where the hell are you? Here, came the answering voice of an angel from the heavens above. Her sweet alto echoed from the stones and multiplied like a heavenly host. Jimmy craned his neck up and saw her, a good 20 feet overhead, perched in one of the openings high in the cone of the stone roof. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. How did you get up there? He yelled, his own voice bouncing off the stones to return as a mincing parody of his mother's. He now understood Mary Moran's fury, when he or his brothers had done something stupid and reckless, and why the sainted lady had gone grey at such an early age. It's lovely. She balanced on her hands, her legs dangling in free fall as she slithered her shoulders and head through the narrow opening, momentarily blocking the light. Her feet were bare, Jimmy saw as he watched her gymnastics with horror. Come down here at once. He bellowed, continuing to channel his mother. The joyous kicking of her feet was his only reply for a few moments. Then her head and upper body reappeared. Jimmy's heart lurched. He spun around, helpless below her as she pushed her body away from the ledge, dangling only by the tips of her fingers. Could he catch her, break her fall if she slipped? Her laughter only made it worse. Then to Jimmy's horror, she began swinging her lower body like a pendulum, back and forth, taunting and terrorizing him as he watched. Grace, be careful. He shouted. He was going to kill her when she got down. If she got down. Then she let go of one hand. Jimmy's fingers clenched into helpless fists, and he couldn't take his eyes off of her, as his breath caught, waiting for the fall. It never came. With practiced ease, Grace used her momentum to swing to another handhold, pulling her body along with her, molding herself against the curve of the wall, well anchored by hands and feet. As Jimmy watched, she continued down the wall, hands and feet scampering from one hole to the next. Like a damned monkey, Jimmy thought, still furious at her for frightening him, but admiring her skill. If it hadn't been for the polished granite walls in Maeve's tomb, she would have gotten herself out without difficulty, he now saw. As Grace reached a point about 8 feet off the ground, the light of the fire and lantern were reflected in the grin she wore. She didn't bother with more climbing, but instead leapt to a spot precisely 2 feet in front of Jimmy, straightening up, arms overhead, as if taking a triumphant curtain call. Ta-da! Her hair was whipped into a frenzy by the wind, her face glowing with effort and enthusiasm, blue eyes blazing in the firelight. Imbeciles, Jimmy thought, taking in this reincarnation of Ireland's warrior queens, this passionate, vibrant woman before him. The monks had been imbeciles to give her an Italian name. Any fool could see it was the blood of this island that ran deep in her. Her teeth gleamed with a ferocious grin and his heart clenched again, but this time not from fear. Grace D'Angelo, Grace of the Angels, indeed, he thought, unable to tear his eyes from her. Devil would be more like it. And damn his soul if he wasn't in love with her himself. Which, in the end, was exactly what had happened, wasn't it? If he had interpreted Leo's cryptic hints correctly, then Jimmy was about to risk eternal damnation. But if he saved Grace, it was worth it. Finally, Jimmy spotted her crossing over the skyway that connected his here and now with the darkness of the tower beyond. Hurry, he urged, knowing that his time was short, their time even shorter. Unless she was ready to take the next step. "I've something to show you," Jimmy told her, as she entered the annex elevator lobby. She nodded at him distractedly, as if she'd become so accustomed to his presence that she no longer paid much attention. When she walked past him, right through him for Chris' sake. He scowled. Didn't she know that the more she took him for granted, ignoring the awful and awesome powers that were converging on this time and place, the less he'd be able to help her? He would simply fade away, a distant memory. Leaving to face what was coming alone. "Grace?" He forced all his fear into his voice, creating a blast of sound as powerful as a thunderbolt. She jumped and spun toward him, eyes wide. "Please," he softened his tone. "Open the door, come with me." Her forehead wrinkled in a frown as she took the 2 steps needed to cross to the door to the rooftop helipad. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I'm not ready." "Surely there's more time." She tilted her face up to him, lips pressed together, the color blanched from them. He heard her thoughts, felt her fear and anguish as if they were his own. And in a way, they were. He raised a hand to stroke her jaw, his thumb caressing her lips, saw them tremble beneath his touch. Seeing wasn't enough. He needed, to feel her. All of her. "Trust me, love. Open the door." Her fingers shook as she turned the key in the lock. It was stiff from lack of use. She needed both hands to twist it. Finally it gave, the key snapping off in her hand as it clicked open. Looking over her shoulder at him, she pushed the heavy steel door open. The helipad was no longer in use, but automatic controls switched its lights on whenever darkness approached. Jimmy placed his hand on her shoulder, looking past her at the waning sun silhouetted behind the tower. "Hurry. Turn the lights off." She stepped over the threshold and turned to a small plastic electrical box beside the door. She opened it and flipped the breaker, leaving them in the half-shadows of the approaching sunset. "Jimmy," she said, her voice tight. "I'm afraid." He knew. When he was alive it had always amazed him that this woman, who appeared so fearless and confident, as strong as any warrior queen, was actually in constant battle with terror. One of his great regrets was that his death had condemned her to a prison of fear. No longer. Not if she was strong enough. Jimmy was certain she was. All he needed to do was to get her to focus that strength, to share it with him. Leo had laughed when he'd suggested it, but Jimmy knew he could do it, that Grace could do it. He had that much faith in her, in their love. He pulled her to him, enveloping her in his arms, yearning for the feel of her silky hair as the wind rippled through it. Now, it's going to be all right," he crooned to her. "Do you remember the first time we made love? On top of the fairy mound?" She sniffed hard, and he felt her scrape together enough strength to brazen a smile. I remember wild jungle sex on the rocks, and an assortment of bruises the next morning. He held her at arm's length. Grace, I'm serious. I need you to remember everything about that night. It's important. Think hard. Concentrate. For Jimmy, that moment 6 years ago was as real as this one now. He remembered feeling strange all that day after the storm broke, releasing them from their captivity in the beehive hut. The seas were still too wild to risk crossing, and the wind kept shifting in strange, unpredictable whirlwinds. As if unseen forces were converging on their island. He had led her to the top of the fairy mound that stood over Maeve's and Concolin's graves. They stood together in the ring of stones that circled the peak, holding hands as the sun set. They say that during the blue time at sunrise and sunset, ghosts cross the veil that lies between heaven and earth. If you listen, you can hear their cries as they try to break free, he had told her. A strange keening had grown, swirling around them, low and faint, setting his teeth on edge. Grace tilted her head to one side, listening, then raised an eyebrow in skepticism. That's just the wind blowing through the ventilation holes in the tombs, she said. That's how you found me when I was trapped below, remember? Indeed he did. The memory of her voice calling him to the rocks beneath the earth, an irresistible siren's song, would not soon fade. Nor would his first sight of her. Face upturned, glowing in the light of his torch. His heart had skipped a beat before almost stampeding from his chest. He'd thought for a moment that she was Maeve herself returned to life. Who could blame him, looking upon that countenance of fierce determination? If sheer willpower alone could have levitated her from that watery grave, she would have soared free without any assistance from a mere mortal like Jimmy. But it was no ancient warrior queen he'd gotten his hands on. Rather a flesh and blood woman, who had stirred his soul in ways no woman before her ever had. Jimmy brushed aside her rational explanation, and took both her hands in his. They stood beneath the lintel stone, facing west. He stretched her arms out so that her palms rested on the vertical stones on either side of them. Can you feel that? The stones themselves are singing. She nodded dreamily, then shook herself and pulled away, breaking the connection. It's only vibrations. I noticed it before down in the monastery. I'll bet it has something to do with water currents. He blew out his breath in irritation, not sure why, but knowing it was important for her to believe. Those Jesuits did their job well, he muttered. Is there anything you won't question? That you can take on faith? Not much. Besides, you're the one who said faith was useless, she said with a smile, challenging him, making a game of it. But this was no game. Not tonight. Not to Jimmy. That was faith in religion, not faith in people, in the power of the unknown. He grabbed her by the shoulders, spun her so that her back was pressed against one of the standing stones. She trembled beneath his touch, as if he'd trapped a wild animal. What did they teach you about love? He demanded. You do believe in love, don't you? Before she could answer, he lowered his face to hers, pressing his lips on hers, stealing her breath. She didn't respond like a frightened animal. Instead she took control, her mouth opening beneath his, her tongue thrusting past his teeth, as she greedily stole all that he had to offer. They parted, the sunset painting her pale skin crimson. I believe, she answered his question. She reached out, snagged his hair between her fingers and dragged his face back down to her. Jimmy plunged into the kiss once more, then broke it off. Jesus, he exhaled, trying to catch his breath. You didn't learn that from any monk. The sky was now a glorious mix of purples and indigo, the sun a mere memory that cast a few last glints of gold against the bottoms of distant clouds. As the sun vanished, the full moon became visible directly above them. The wind had risen, now swirled around them, as if making them part of the stone ring. He pivoted Grace so that he held her tight, both facing out through the standing stones. This is a special night, a magic night, he whispered. The autumn equinox, Mabon. A night of thanksgiving. Mabon? Michaelmas, the English call it, the feast of the archangel. On this night, spirits can walk among us. The boundaries between heaven and earth are loosed, power fills the air. A night when wishes can come true. A shooting star spiraled across the twilight. There's your star, Grace. Make a wish. Lucas banged his head against his window. She was here, had been here, so tantalizingly close, and he couldn't reach her. But he was certain. Not even the stale, recirculated, reconditioned hospital air could hide her scent from him. Across from his window, the annex door opened, a rectangle of light encroaching on the twilight of the helipad. He watched as a woman crossed the threshold. The light behind her surrounded her in a halo, the flashing red lights of the helipad bathed her features in fire. His breath caught in his throat as his fingers splayed on the glass panes, straining to reach her. Grace? She turned and the lights were extinguished, the door shut, leaving her shrouded in darkness. But nothing could hide her from his eyes, not now that he knew where to look. She had come for him, to rescue him. God, what she must think. Did she curse his name for abandoning her these long, 4 years? Yet, still she came, searching. For him. Her one true love. Her forever love. I didn't want to, he shouted, pounding on the glass in a futile effort to get her attention. It wasn't my choice. They tricked me. They took you from me. Grace? She turned to face him, and for one brief moment his entire being was filled with the ecstasy of her love. Blue bolts of lightning began to shower her, a curtain shielding her from his eyes. There was no rain, no thunder. Even the wind had died. Yet it was as if the heavens above were lashing out, determined to stop her from seeing him. He called out her name, his shouts echoing through the small room, rattling the glass, pounding through his bones. As quickly as it began, the lightning storm ended. Grace stood there, whole, somehow untouched by the heavenly wrath. But she was no longer alone. Luca's scream died before he could give it voice. His throat clenched tight with terror. He was back, returned from hell itself. The devil reborn. He watched in horror, as the demon spawn, that was Jimmy Moran, took Grace into his arms, holding her captive in an embrace that threatened to choke the life from her. Cold spiraled through the glass into the silver platinum of his wedding band, racing into his very soul. Grace had risked herself to come to his aid, but now it was up to Lucas to save her from Moran. Again. Grace's story reminds us that even in the darkest hours, hope and courage can guide us forward. Let our channel be your source of strength. Subscribe and let's light the way together.